So if you're tired of the same old story, turn some pages. I'll be here when you're ready to roll with the changes. The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. The Cabin in the Woods is the sort of movie I wouldn't have thought to see on title alone. It sounds like exactly what it's not. Another generic spook fest about some underdeveloped college kids who go to a creepy cabin in the middle of the woods, do stupid things that anger whatever unexplained, badly integrated CG creatures haunt the place, and get most of themselves killed. And despite knowing Joss Whedon was involved when I finally saw it, I was taken aback and delighted by the passion project it turned out to be. It isn't just a horror pastiche or a riff on this familiar and tired situation. It's a dissection of the formula that builds an immersive mythology around an in-story explanation for that very formula. It asks the question, can a movie conform to the standard outline of most careless kids go to the woods and get killed movies and make it a real story? One that's about more than seeing stock characters get eviscerated. The answer we get here is yes, but then the source of its entertainment has to come from a more thoughtful, more human place. There's plenty of levity in how our protagonists react to the bizarre and absurd nature of their universe, and it doesn't resort to trying to force comedy out of carnage. It's not about how far it can push the envelope of brutality, it's about what it says about us as a species that any of us gets pleasure out of seeing human beings suffer gruesome brutality. Co-creators Joss Whedon and Drew Goddard succeed at crafting a chilling tale that's scary on a lot of levels, carnally, psychologically, philosophically, that started as a love letter to the entire horror genre, but became a critical analysis of everything that's wrong with a lot of movies in that genre. Before I get into the social and cultural commentary, I want to delve into the narrative structure, because I think its simplicity and sophistication has a lot to do with why the high-concept stuff works so well. Whedon and Goddard put on a clinic in telling an engaging story via the traditional three-act approach. There are so many horror elements and motifs thrown into one giant pot that if the story had been delivered any other way, it might have been totally convoluted and impossible to digest. Screenwriting courses should use this movie to demonstrate that structure, because it's textbook, and it's a great example of how effective it can be. Act 1, we've got our break-in status quo and establishing conflict. There are two subplots that are already fully integrated, but we're establishing them separately. Secret shadow government workers are manipulating 5 kids into going to a cabin in the woods, while we see those 5 kids going to said cabin. The inciting incident, which always closes your opening act as the first plot point, is the death of Julie, when the kids finally discover they're in a house of horrors and they've just raised zombies that want them dead. Zombie redneck torture family. Act 2 is our rising action. This middle section is usually a period of self-discovery, where our protagonists find what they're made of based on how they handle the obstacles that stand in the way of what they want. 2 more of the group are killed in terrible and tragic ways, and the remaining kids come to realize that they're in a man-made facade and puppet masters, to quote Marty, are pulling the strings. Through their actions, we find that they're opposites. Dana is optimistic, impulsive, and tends to leap before she looks, and then thinks better of it later, while Marty is paranoid, cynical, and afraid to take chances. After Marty reveals to Dana that he's still alive, the two of them manage to pull the curtain all the way back to find the underground facility responsible for this nightmare. That's our second plot point. Act 3 is the climax and resolution. Our protagonists fight their way through the facility while the adult technicians try desperately to kill at least Marty, because, as it's gradually revealed, this is about an ancient ritual in which all the teens except the virgin must ultimately be killed, or the ancient ones will return and bring about the end of the world. With the dramatic question answered, our protagonists are faced with their opportunity to change. Neither takes it, and that leads to the end of the world as we know it. And they feel fine. It might seem like an obvious choice to tackle this material like that. I mean, lots of movies are in 3 acts, so why praise it for that? But the reason I'm spelling it out this way is to illustrate how simple a story it seems in execution versus just how complex and layered it is when we start breaking it down. It's one of the most efficiently told movies I've seen. Every scene, detail, and line is there with a purpose, nothing included that doesn't reveal something. It's totally cohesive, and despite 2 interwoven subplots, several characters it has to believably draw for us and make them real people despite being manipulated to act out a character, and despite the dozens of horror motifs it has to organically integrate into the rules of its world, it gets it all done in only an hour and a half. It's as effortless as if there was nothing more to it than some kids going to the woods and most of them get hacked up. It's the kind of writing that makes me violently jealous, and Goddard and Whedon wrote it over 3 days in a hotel room. The story points and rules of the world are presented in such a logical way that I never feel lost, even when I don't have all the answers, and I'm always confident that the script will eventually pay off its mysteries. I love the choice to open in the underground facility rather than starting with the kids, because it naturally provides pieces to an ever-growing puzzle, gradually until the third act, when we realize that the stakes are global. Rather than suddenly revealing there's been a corporate machine behind the carnage all along, the audience is allowed glimpses into that world, so we can start to put the motivation behind the game together ourselves. It's made a more compelling and intriguing mystery because there are all these weird components that don't immediately add up, but that we expect to, and it's satisfying when we finally learn how all the cogs fit together. For instance, even though we're made aware pretty early that these technicians are watching the teenagers and manipulating the cabin, we still don't know the motivation behind what they're doing and why these intelligent, likable kids are suddenly acting like the idiotic jerk faces I kinda expected to see in the first place. It's like Fight Club. I think I understand what I'm watching, I'm engaged enough to stay actively involved, but when I watch it a second time, there's a new layer that's scraped off, and I'm having a whole new experience. It's bad when you have to watch a movie twice because its basic story points aren't made explicit enough that you'd pick up on what's going on first viewing. It's wonderful to have to watch a movie twice because it's operating on multiple levels that your brain isn't consciously processing simultaneously. The first time I saw it, I subconsciously appreciated these characters and was mortified by what happens to them, but I was consciously thinking about what it was saying about the horror movie industry. On a second viewing, I picked up on a whole lot more character stuff, and I could now articulate why these were more than just the standard archetypes. I also picked up on just how many things are set up and then paid off later, and I was already impressed with that, with things like Hadley's obsession with mermen, and his poetic death at the hands, or face I guess, of one of those. What I didn't notice first time out was that in the cellar, Kurt picks up a conch and very nearly summons the merman. The director's ominous presence is felt in the compound throughout the film, well before she's finally revealed as Sigourney Weaver in the last scene, and what an awesome coup that is. The title director is referred to several times by the technicians, and that's who is on the inauspicious red phone when they discover they failed to kill Marty. But it didn't register to me first time around that she's who's talking to Marty and Dana over the PA system, encouraging them to stop running and get the inevitable over with. I imagine I'll pick up on another slew of new details and subtleties next time I see it. The movie mostly works because it gives the audience so much credit. We're not spoon-fed exposition through forced lines of dialogue, and by the time someone does finally explain all the rules, it's the climax, and it's being told to our protagonists who have spent the whole movie waiting for someone to finally clue them in to why this hell is happening to them. I've got some issues with that last scene, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. What information we're given when is certainly calculated, but it feels natural. We're a fly on the wall as these workers go about their business like it's just another day at the office, which allows us to get to know them along with the kids. But they're more than malevolent villains scheming in the background. I'm surprised by how my emotions are manipulated right along with the kids because of how the movie subverts my expectations. And again, I think it partly manages that because of how familiar that overt 3-act format is. I should be rooting for the kids and booing the adults, but by the end, it's hard to decide who I want to win. These adults have allowed themselves to become drones in a detestable catacomb. They help murder children, they bet on how they're going to die, and they throw a party and dance around to REO Speedwagon when they succeed. There are lots of examples where sparks of humanity are still there, and as Amy Acker's character, Wendy Lynn, says, they're just blowing off steam, trying to keep their sanity in the midst of necessary evil they're a part of. But compare them to Daniel Truman, the new security head, who is appalled at the lack of decency and respect for the sacrifice these kids are being forced to make. And it's clear this place has warped these employees and reduced them to something base and uncivilized. But I can't call them villains. The teens are certainly the victims here, and since all the adults die horrible and poetic deaths at the hands, talons, and claws of the creatures they use to terrorize children, the movie is clearly coming down on them as unjustified and morally bereft. But then our victims end up destroying the world by refusing to make the, as Captain America puts it in The Avengers, sacrifice play. The teens want to survive and the adults want to save the world. Whose side should I be sitting on in the stands? The more the movie conforms to the slasher formula, the more it subverts my expectations, because I keep expecting it to turn those horror tropes on their heads, and instead it constantly provides story reasons that things have to turn out the way you would expect them to, until, of course, Marty refuses to die at the end. When it finally allows itself to break the rules, the consequence is the end of the world. The arrangement this underground corporation secretly has with the Ancient Ones serves as a super clever explanation for every horror movie ever, why so many of them are as contrived and cliche as they are, and why their characters are so often two-dimensional morons. I recently saw Freddy vs. Jason for the first time since it came out in 2003, and it was really hard to sit through after rewatching The Cabin in the Woods. I can certainly appreciate consistent but unrealistic story logic, and I can appreciate a heightened, stylized world, but those movies work within a specific set of rules designed to maximize the number of kill scenarios and to trick an audience into enjoying senseless violence. Seeing those tropes creatively integrated into a believable and thoughtful narrative made them feel even less creative than I thought they were in something like Freddy vs. Jason. Cabin says that in reality, hardly anybody is as stupid as the protagonists in those movies, so the technicians have to dumb them down just like the writers of a slasher script. The director is basically directing a crappy horror movie, and these tech guys are the writers, contriving whatever they can to force these kids into doing things no reasonable person would ever do, regardless of age. And I guess the Ancient Ones are the studio executives with mandates that must be met. Or else. I love moments where drugged characters suggest something idiotic that's sure to get them killed, and Marty, the immunized voice of reason, is baffled that they even suggest it. Like when Kurt says they should split up right after he suggested the common sense idea, hey, zombies are trying to kill us, let's stay together. Probably my favorite contrived stereotype is Jules, who becomes the dumb blonde when the technicians screw with her hair dye, and her blondness literally seeps into her scalp and recedes into her brain. Practically nothing happens by chance in this movie, and so everything that happens by chance in other horror films becomes that much more glaring to me. It tackles the big stuff, the creepy old man who looks practically undead himself, warns the kids not to go to the spooky death house, the cellar where they awaken unfathomable evil, and again, the order in which everyone's supposed to die. But I'm really impressed with all the little stuff, like pheromone dust, which increases Jules' sex drive enough that she'll actually get wild out in the dark woods with Kurt. What impressed me about that is that it also gives an explanation for the ridiculous amounts of dry ice you always see in a scene like that. The techs even thought of that twilight through the trees mood lighting. And to tie this back into my point about how meticulously plotted it is, there are little inconsistencies I thought were oversights the first time I saw it that I'm pretty sure now were intentional and can be explained by the puppet master's manipulations. When Holden sees Dana start to take her clothes off on the other side of a one-way mirror, he does the gentlemanly thing and goes into her room to tell her about it. He says he put the disturbing painting of death back up to block the mirror, but offers to switch rooms with her to make her more comfortable, so she won't worry she's being watched by a strange man she just met while she's undressing. But when Dana moves into that room, the picture's still not on the mirror. Mistake? I think not. That mirror is one of the ways the techs try to manipulate Dana and Holden to develop a sexual attraction for each other. Random things creepily but subtly moving around with no explanation is another horror trope. I bet the techs had some way remotely to remove the picture so Dana would see Holden getting undressed as well. I also imagine it's no accident that the kid's camper is nearly out of gas just before it conveniently gets to the Harbinger's gas station. These are little details that need no explanation because so much of how the techs get things accomplished is revealed. They come off as intentional plants to see if the audience is paying attention rather than mistakes. Now, I don't know for sure that these examples aren't oversights, but I'd be really surprised if they were. So yeah, the way the horror tropes are utilized is neat and clever, but what is the movie really saying about these kinds of movies? Some of it is stuff we've seen before, because the slasher genre has been a snake eating its tail for a long time now. The genre is so played out that the only way to make it feel fresh again, as we saw with the Scream franchise, has been to be self-aware about the tropes and deconstruct the genre within the genre. So certainly some of that, it's played out and predictable messages there, and by the end, I had a really hard time imagining what the point was of making any more of these kinds of scary movies unless they're actually about characters you're allowed to root for. The homage is the love letter and where the fun lies. It's the way in which the violence plays that's the sober, pause-inducing commentary. The movie celebrates the good in horror and condemns the bad. It doesn't suggest that every horror movie is exploitative or filled with genera speak, criticisms Goddard and Whedon lob at slashers in their commentary. There's an argument inherent in the narrative that these movies can be intelligent and be about something and still count as horror movies. It's probably no coincidence that the branches of monster facilities failed their missions to complete the ritual in every other country before America. That suggests that our horror movies tend to be the most cynical, the most morally completely bereft and appeal to the more primitive of sensibilities. The technicians who have watched helpless children get murdered time and time again are desensitized to the violence. We see slivers of humanity from some of them, like Hadley's speech about how he's starting to actually root for Dana after all the turmoil she's been through, but his priorities immediately reassert themselves when someone brings tequila to the party. Lynn tries to explain their crass behavior to Truman as a coping mechanism, but being new to this awful operation, it's disturbing and wrong to him, like someone might react to their first time seeing a slasher flick. This guy runs security. He seems hardened and emotionless, like he's perhaps seen some combat. And I like that what's going on turns even his stomach, like it would anyone who didn't allow themselves to become accustomed to it. There's a certain logic to Lynn's argument. Humans adapt to survive, and if her colleagues didn't find a way to keep morale up and couldn't make themselves see it as just a job they did to pay the bills that someone else would be doing if they weren't there, they'd lose their minds. The question is, when you constantly benefit from someone else's suffering, are you slowly forfeiting your humanity anyway? Goddard was inspired by a small town where the atomic bomb was developed. People just working every day to do a job and pay their bills and not really thinking about the consequences. The most poignant moment in the movie for me is when Hadley tells Truman, "You get used to it," and Truman responds with, "Should we?" Interesting that Truman shares his last name with a president who felt it necessary to order a terrible deed in order to, as he saw it, save the world. That's precisely what the people at this facility are doing, except they've been witness to the slaughtering of innocent people for so long, they're apathetic about it now. The security head understands what's at stake, what's necessary, but he, like Harry S. Truman, takes no joy in what must be done. What's much worse than the senseless slaying of kids for the amusement of ancient gods is what that practice has reduced the people involved to, something almost less than human. The movie doesn't condemn violence, but rather violence without consequences. The people who derive pleasure watching these kids suffer represent audiences who have been conditioned to go to the movies to watch people get mutilated rather than a movie like this, where people are mutilated, but it's graphic and awful and not at all fun to watch. There's a point to it. At one point, Sitterson explains to Truman that these kids can't be punished without transgression. It's part of the ritual that they have to make the choices that lead to their demise of their own free will. But as evidenced by Hadley's surprise that he's developed empathy toward Dana, it's clear that they've grown accustomed to seeing their victims as the non-entities characters in schlocky horror films often are. It's easier to enjoy violence when you see the people you're watching get eviscerated as less than human, which is what movies have to do to make us laugh instead of cringe when someone gets, say, impaled in the back with a giant bear trap. I'm not saying that farcical, over-the-top cartoon violence, even when it's gory, can't be funny in the right context, or that this movie is implying that, but I think it is suggesting that it's mentally and emotionally unhealthy to become too used to seeing people suffer. I love how brutal and hard to watch some of the deaths of the teenagers are. I feel incredibly bad for Jules, and her death is visceral and mortifying, a death that, presented in a different context, where she was actually a dumb blonde who wanted to sleep with everything that moves, might play more for comedy. It hurts to watch because I care about this character. She's been violated and humiliated, and now agonizingly ripped apart. The brilliance of this movie is that it's more horrendous to imagine being transformed into one of these stereotypes and then hunted down and torn to pieces than just being hunted down and torn to pieces. It's horrifying to imagine someone making you less than human and then being entertained by your misfortune. I think I feel even worse for Jules than I would have because the technicians are enjoying her taking her top off just before she gets beheaded, like it's pornography. It's never fun to mix sex and violence in this movie, and it's never fun to see children put in danger. Goddard and Whedon are very careful about never crossing either of those lines too far. There is one place where I found the deaths a little entertaining, though still disturbing at the same time, and that's when Dana lets the monsters loose in the compound and they kill all the workers in the facility. That's partially just because it's so darn satisfying to see all these creatures that have been teased throughout the movie doing their thing. If you're paying attention to the artifacts in the cellar, and if you're a total nerd and pause the screen at the whiteboard to read all the spooky stuff the kids have the potential to unleash, it all pays off in the third act. We get to see all of that stuff. But also, the movie has somewhat dehumanized the workers, and so they're kind of getting what's coming to them. film. It's more complicated than that, of course, but for me, the very phenomenon the movie is commenting on, that violence is only fun when you see the people who are dying as less than human and deserving of death, works in practice in this very movie. It's life imitating art. We all have that savage side to our personalities, and it's important to keep that in check. Sure, I laughed at the exaggerated gore in Sharknado, but I also felt sick to my stomach while I watched a zombie throw Dana the severed head of her best friend. If you're ever wondering if you're losing touch with your own sense of empathy, this movie might be a good test. Marty gives us the tagline for the film when he starts to piece together that there's a human force at work behind all the supernatural mayhem. We are not who we are. Our 5 protagonists are forced into roles none of them fully embody. There's a grain of truth to each, but it's a movie about how everyone is at least a little more complex than the cardboard cutouts we so often put on screen and call characters. Even though the movie is technically fulfilling the requirements of the formula, because the real versions of these characters aren't what they're boxed into by the technicians, it actually manages to turn this on its head a little. The most likable and most well put together characters all get killed first. The whore, who is corrupted and supposed to die first, is actually a lot more innocent than the virgin, and again, the most tragic victim. I would have liked to see a little of Jules before she turns blonde, because I never get to know the real her, and it's hard to know how much of what she does is informed by her real personality. But still, the movie makes it crystal clear by the confused reactions of her friends and just how exaggerated her sexuality and idiocy is that she's not herself and that she's being violated. I'm impressed that I still care about what happens to her despite only seeing her as the dumb blonde. I think that's partly because I can put together some of her personality by the way pre-drugged Kurt treats her, because he's a stand-up and gracious guy, and by a lot of the details were given by the rest of her friends, like her being in pre-med and the kinds of books she used to digest before she was transformed. There is a lot going on in the scene where she makes out with a stuffed wolf's head. First off, I think it represents the filmmaker's obsession with all these creepy motifs and images. Reminds me of the old childish expression, if you love it, why don't you marry it? And it foreshadows the werewolf at the end. But for Jules' character, it's a sad, perverse moment of degradation, where she's reduced to her base instincts just before she's killed by undead people who are as much animals as the beast she pretends to seduce. I think that scene has a lot to do with why her death is so hard for me to watch. She's beheaded right after making out with a disembodied wolf head. She loses her head because it's supposed to be poetic justice for someone who doesn't use hers, but of course, she really does. Oh, and I should also mention that the bear trap is an interesting choice of weapon, given that the kids are lured to this location just like a bear to a trap and forced to stay there, while they struggle to find a way to free themselves until death comes for them. So next we have Kurt, who's supposed to be the dumb, underachieving, womanizing jock, and in real life, the only things he has in common with that archetype is that he likes sports, has a goofy smile, and he's really handsome. Thor himself would fill that archetype better than Kurt does. This guy is a natural-born leader. He's considerate to his friends, he sets the mood and the example for them for the weekend, he's a sociology major, he's savvy about what choice of material would most impress his teachers, because if you've been to college for any kind of liberal arts degree, you know that the art of BSing is a necessity. And by the time the drugs have worn off and we get to see more of the real Kurt again after he's been transformed into the hedonistic chauvinist, have sex with me in the woods woman because that's what I brought you here for cliche, we realize he's also the selfless hero who will risk his life to save his friends. This guy is supposed to be totally out for himself. The guy who sees his half-naked girlfriend getting her head lopped off and all he's thinking about is his own neck. It's just as sad when he dies as Jules' death is. Just less brutal to have to sit through, especially because it reinforces just how trapped the rest of them are. This is also, by the way, the first time I've ever seen a movie where an eagle symbolizes the opposite of freedom. And because of the dirtbag Kurt gets turned into, he's almost as violated as Dana is. I love that his dirt bike has the number 88 in front. The number of miles per hour the DeLorean had to be moving before it could travel through time. Kurt thinks all he has to do is to get enough momentum to go back to the world he knows and bring back help to save his friends. If he could get over that gap, it would be like going back in time after everything he's witnessed. The world the way he knew it yesterday is not the same after he discovers the undead are real. But what he doesn't know yet is that he's a rat trapped in a maze and there's no going back. And if you think I'm stretching with the Back to the Future reference, just remember, this is a movie with a guy named Marty in it. Third, we have Holden, the Egghead, who's supposed to be the nerdy genius, antisocial guy. Like Kurt, there's a sliver of truth in the role he's forced into, but he's another well-rounded, more complex person. He's smart, sure, but he doesn't seem any more bookwormy than most of the others, when they are who they are. The one moment where his genius becomes a device to move the story along is when he translates the Latin inscription Dana speaks aloud to summon the Buckners, and he's surprised his 10th grade Latin came back to him so easily. I suspect the puppet masters are somehow responsible for that as well. He's a gentleman, and he's charming with Dana, who Jules is trying to set him up with. Were he the consummate nerd, he'd be awkward, put his foot in his mouth in a really crass way, and he'd likely be a total pervert. He and Dana have a real chemistry together, and it's impossible to tell how much of their attraction is manufactured by the technician's manipulations and how much of it is genuine. I like putting them together because Holden is exactly what Dana needs after her ill-conceived love affair with one of her professors. Dana overcompensates for her insecurities and takes unnecessary risks to prove she's assertive. She often thinks better of those right away and tries to backtrack and take them back. Holden, on the other hand, is comfortable in his own skin and doesn't buckle under pressure, as we see when he tries to develop a survival plan right after Kurt gets killed, telling her to get a grip and not to shut down. Unfortunately for her, he's impaled through the throat and gets killed right then. Arguably, these three, Jules, Kurt, and Holden, are kids in age alone. They've already passed into full-on adulthood, because again, people are complicated, and we emotionally mature at different rates. The three of them have a direction, a sense of purpose, and they know who they are, while Marty and Dana are paralyzed by fear and are lost in their identity. It would be easy to read the ending as cynical and fatalistic, that Goddard and Whedon are saying that humanity is a lost cause, and Marty lets the world end because people are beyond saving. But then the filmmakers populate their movie with people who are absolutely worth saving. Imagine how things might have turned out if one of the others had made it to the end, and the director gave them the choice to dine with their friends or for them. It's hard to know what Julie would do, because again, she's the one who's trapped the whole movie behind the veneer of a dumb blonde, but we know she's confident, spunky, and going to medical school. She cares about and believes in people. She likely wouldn't have made the choice Marty does. Even though part of Kurt's motivation in going for help was to avenge his girlfriend, I think he'd try to save as many of his friends as he could and the rest of the world, and he proves his selflessness on the dirt bike. And Holden has this classic Superman, there's always another way attitude. If faced with the no-win scenario here, he'd probably sacrifice himself too, but he'd likely give Dana this big speech about how there must be a way to get the upper hand on these gods, and she should do everything she can to try to stop the vicious cycle. Marty is supposed to be the fool, so naturally, in this movie, the fool is the one person who's immune to suggestion and always sees what's really going on. He's also the standard stoner, but that cliche comes from a character place. He's too afraid of reality to really live in it, so he's constantly high so he can escape from it. I like that his pot counteracts the other drugs the technicians try to use on him, so no matter what he does, he's forced to face reality. Although I'm fuzzy on why Marty's drugs make him immune. Lynn is baffled by this in one moment and says they, quote, treated the hell out of them, and later the texts talk almost like he's taking some unknown drug they couldn't do anything to. They've planned for nearly every possible contingency and have been spying on these kids for presumably a good long time. So I would have figured they would know precisely what he was smoking and would know whether or not their treatment of it would be effective. That's one of the only story points I think is convenient and lacks a solid explanation. Unlike the more well-adjusted of his friends, Marty does fit pretty snugly into his role, even though he's a fully realized character. He is the fool. He's a conspiracy theorist who complains that his freedoms are being taken from him, yet he purposefully gives up control to a substance because he's a coward. This is a really minor example of his hypocrisy, but right before his speech against government surveillance and deception, he disguises a bong as a coffee cup. That also serves as one of the most subtle and fantastic foreshadowing moments of a big high-concept reveal I have ever seen. The coffee cup is really this instrument of drug-induced bliss, and the cabin in the woods is really an instrument of drug-induced nightmare. And side note, it is a stroke of genius to cast the guy who programmed the dolls in Dollhouse as the kid who's terrified to essentially become a doll in this movie. Dana is supposed to be the innocent virgin, and she's really neither of those things. Apparently, the compound couldn't find 5 local college kids who all knew each other. 2 of them were girls, and one had never been with a man. We work with what we have, the director says. And I also don't understand why it's so ambiguous about whether or not Dana has ever had sex before. I imagine the director envies Zordon a lot. All he needed was 5 teenagers with attitude, although curiously still 3 boys and 2 girls with a headstrong leader type, a nerdy super genius, a spunky sexy girl, and a shy reserved girl. Man, if Zack had been a stoner, this could have been a Power Rangers movie. And that's a formula that needs this treatment just as badly. Anyway, Dana is, ironically, the one of the 5 who is most personally responsible for what happens to them. She reads the diary that wakes the Buckners, with plenty of protests from Marty, because again, she's in the middle of a dare, and she wants to prove that she's not a coward. Nobody calls me chicken! She doesn't seem to be under the influence of anything in that scene. In fact, I'm not sure she's under the influence at all throughout the film, despite all the variables that had to be manipulated to get them there. This is her defining characteristic, and she never really learns from it. Again, because the people who had the best chance to guide her out of those insecurities all get killed. And Marty's a wreck in his own right. She even accidentally kills Sitterson because of this leap before you look reflex. At the end, she pulls a gun on Marty, and given the gravity of the situation, picks the worst possible time to finally start thinking before she acts. I'm not saying anyone wouldn't hesitate to kill their friend, even with the fate of the world at stake, but if she was more confident, she might have come to a decision before she gets attacked by a werewolf. When she apologizes for trying to shoot Marty, she says, "I probably wouldn't have," and I believe her. We have 2 extremes between our remaining 2 kids and our adult office drones. Indecisiveness and inability to put emotion aside and do what has to be done on one side, and being too comfortable with necessary evil on the other. Marty and Dana both represent the point the ancient ones have about youth. It comes with inexperience, impulsiveness, insecurity, foolishness, and carelessness. They're everything that's wrong with being young. The director and her colleagues are everything that's wrong with being old. Our other 3 teens are the healthy midpoint, and they're killed off halfway into the movie. Marty sees things in black and white and can't appreciate what the puppet masters feel they have to do. He sees through the facade and thinks he sees through a societal facade going all the way back to the beginning of the movie. Even though I'm not totally sure I buy that he makes this choice, his decision to let the world end matches up with his argument at the beginning of the film when he says that we're all being controlled, freedom is an illusion, and that we should let society crumble. He's a classic Joss Whedon character. He has an important destiny, and if he doesn't embrace it, there will be catastrophic consequences. Often in Whedon stories, embracing destiny is synonymous with doing the right thing. It isn't that your fate is laid out for you, so whatever happens was always going to happen. It's that you have a clear role to play, and it's up to you to decide whether or not to take it. It's often harsh, cruel, and unfair, but those are the cards life deals you, and fate ends up being just a more dramatic way to say responsibility. But the question is, in this case, who's right? This is a responsibility forced on someone through an unjust and sadistic game. And Marty's point is that perhaps the species shouldn't continue if this is what it has to be in order to live on. Maybe it's better to let the species die than lose that which makes us human. But as I said, I do have a tough time believing even Marty would have it in himself to stubbornly allow all of humanity to die for his convictions. Again, I think it comes from a character place, and the movie is exploring a side of youth here rather than saying there's no hope for humanity. After all, I'm pretty sure we don't really live in a world where we only persist because giant gods under the earth demand periodic sacrifices, but I wish we could live in this moment a little longer. I understand Marty's viewpoint, I appreciate it, and I still somehow don't fully believe he could really bring himself to do what he does. Or that Dana comes to decide he's right, although that's a little easier because it's too late now. She's trying to make her peace with it, and she does have a pattern of doing something and immediately thinking better of it. Their last exchange is emotional, heart-wrenching, and funny all at the same time. I'm sorry I let you get attacked by a werewolf and then ended the world. And I love the ending as the final nail in the bad slasher pick coffin. The machine that creates that dreck is finally destroyed and the crappy horror film world comes to an end. But don't these kids have families? That's something that's never discussed. Isn't there someone that at least one of them couldn't bear to lose regardless of the moral principles that would be defined by allowing these rituals to continue? It's one of those places where the scales start to tip from ideas presented through characters making choices to those ideas taking over. And the efficiency of the piece almost becomes a detriment here. I can't say the ending is rushed because it starts with only like 8 minutes left before the world ends, but things get convenient all of a sudden to hurry up and get the world ended. Why doesn't the director just walk in and shoot Marty instead of explaining the rules to him? I mean, We need all that to complete the mythology and tie together the thematic threads, but we know that how Marty dies doesn't matter because guys with guns are told to kill him. All she has to do is walk in, fire, problem solved. And two monsters walk in, as if on cue, to attack or kill characters in more poetic or ironic ways. I love that Dana's attacked by a werewolf. They're like her. They're people who suddenly do things and then think better of them when they return to their senses. But it's a little silly that it just pops up at just the right moment. And of course, Patience. Wait, sorry, wrong zombie named Patience. There we go. The girl who Dana resurrected also shows up just at the right moment to kill the director, who has perpetuated this awful ritual and has used her and her fellow undead just as much as she has used Dana and her friends. I like a lot of things about that. It's neat that the movie somehow humanizes some of these creatures at the end. It's not their fault they've been stuffed in a glass menagerie and they're sicked on unsuspecting kids every so often. Really kind of wish I knew just how often, when Patience probably just wants to rest for eternity. Ah well, I guess she gets her wish now. Come to think of it, some of them probably benefit a lot from the end of the world. And speaking of monsters, could we get some spin-offs of this movie? I don't mean some convoluted sequel or a prequel, but just make some of the movies that would play out some of these other scenarios. A lot of them are things we've seen before because they're homages to other horror subgenres. We probably have enough creepy clown movies, but I want to see the Dragon Bat movie. Oh, and I never noticed that this movie starts with an article adjective. It's not Cabin in the Woods, but The Cabin in the Woods. It really does change the meaning of the title. It's not just some generic cabin, it's The Cabin in the Woods, because they're all the same. And in this world, every movie you've seen with that scenario has taken place at this one. Like Dr. Horrible, The Cabin in the Woods is a clever, witty, hilarious, and by the end also a really heavy and somewhat depressing story that thoughtfully asks big questions about who we are and how far we've really come. It blends that with a commentary on an aspect of our culture and what it says about us, and creates something truly fresh and original using all the toys in its very, very old toy box. I'm giving it a 3.5 out of 4.